We don't have a choice. It's the only way.
No, there has to be another way. Please.
The Eloá Pimentel case, when love became prison and police errors cost a life. In the quiet suburb of Santo André, São Paulo, there lived a 15-year-old girl whose dreams of becoming a lawyer would be cut short by a tragedy that would shock Brazil and expose fundamental flaws in how authorities handle hostage situations. Eloá Cristina Pimentel was a studious, peaceful teenager who had recently ended her relationship with 22-year-old Lindenberg Alves, a possessive and controlling young man who refused to accept that their romance was over. What began as a typical teenage breakup would escalate into one of the most watched and controversial hostage situations in Brazilian history, a 5-day ordeal that would be broadcast live on national television and ultimately end in tragedy. The case would expose serious failures in police negotiation tactics, media responsibility, and the protection of domestic violence victims. On October 13, 2008, Lindenberg invaded the Pimentel family apartment armed with a pistol, taking Eloá and her friend Nayara Rodrigues hostage in front of a horrified nation. For 5 consecutive days, millions of Brazilians watched as police negotiators tried to resolve the situation while television cameras captured every moment of the drama. But this wasn't just a story about a crime, it was a story about institutional failures, media sensationalism, and the deadly consequences of treating domestic violence as entertainment rather than the serious threat it represents. The police errors during the negotiation process would become as much a part of the tragedy as Lindenberg's violence, raising questions about training, protocols, and the role of media in crisis situations. Eloá Pimentel's death would become a symbol of femicide in Brazil and a cautionary tale about how not to handle hostage negotiations. Her story would inspire changes in police protocols and spark national conversations about domestic violence. But those changes would come too late to save her life. This is the story of a young woman whose dreams were destroyed by obsessive love, and whose death exposed the dangerous incompetence of those sworn to protect her. It's a story that forces us to examine how society responds to domestic violence, and how the pursuit of ratings and headlines can interfere with the preservation of human life. If you think you understand the complexities of hostage negotiations, and the challenges of protecting domestic violence victims, you are about to discover how a series of preventable errors can transform a rescue operation into a national tragedy. The young dreamer, Eloá Cristina Pimentel, was everything a parent could hope for in a daughter. Age 15, she was a dedicated student at Escola Estadual Diadema, where she maintained excellent grades and was known for her quiet, respectful demeanor. She lived with her mother, Ana Cristina Pimentel, in a modest apartment in Santo André, a working-class suburb of São Paulo, where she spent her time studying, helping with household chores, and dreaming of her future. Eloá's greatest ambition was to become a lawyer. She was fascinated by the idea of fighting for justice and helping people who couldn't defend themselves. Her teachers described her as intelligent and determined, someone who had the potential to achieve whatever she set her mind to. She would often talk about attending university and building a career that would allow her to make a difference in the world. Despite her young age, Eloá was mature for her years, perhaps a result of growing up in a single-parent household where she had learned to be responsible and independent. She helped her mother with household expenses by working part-time and was careful with money, saving whatever she could for her education. Eloá's relationship with Lindenberg Alves had begun when she was just 14 years old. Lindenberg, 7 years older than Eloá, worked as a security guard and had initially seemed charming and protective. To a young girl who had grown up without a father figure, his attention and apparent maturity were appealing. He would bring her gifts, walk her home from school, and make her feel special and loved. But what had started as a sweet teenage romance gradually became something darker and more controlling. Lindenberg's protective nature evolved into possessiveness, and his attention became surveillance. He would call Eloá constantly, demanding to know where she was and who she was with. He became jealous of her friendships, her family relationships, and even her academic ambitions. The controlling behavior escalated over the months they were together. Lindenberg would show up at Eloá's school unannounced, claiming he was there to protect her but actually monitoring her interactions with classmates. He would go through her phone, questioning her about every contact and message. He isolated her from friends who he felt were bad influences, gradually reducing her social circle to people he approved of. Eloá's grades began to suffer as the stress of the relationship took its toll. Her teachers noticed that she seemed distracted and tired, often appearing to be worried about something. When they tried to talk to her about her declining performance, she would make excuses and promise to do better. But the underlying problems continued. The breaking point came in September 2008, when Eloá finally found the courage to end the relationship. She had realized that Lindenberg's behavior wasn't normal or healthy, and she wanted to focus on her studies and her future. She told him that she needed space to concentrate on school and that their relationship was over. Lindenberg's reaction was immediate and intense. He refused to accept the breakup, insisting that Eloá was making a mistake and that they belonged together. He began calling her constantly, showing up at her apartment and school, and pleading with her to reconsider. When she remained firm in her decision, his pleas turned to threats, and his love turned to obsession. The invasion. On the morning of October 13, 2008, Eloá was at home in her family's apartment with her friend Niera Rodriguez and 2 other classmates. They were working on a school project, enjoying the relaxed atmosphere of a typical teenage gathering. Eloá's mother was at work, and the teenagers had the apartment to themselves to study and socialize. At approximately 2:30 p.m., Lindenberg arrived at the apartment building. He had been calling Eloá repeatedly over the previous weeks, begging her to take him back and becoming increasingly agitated when she refused. On this day, his desperation had reached a breaking point, and he had decided to take drastic action to force Eloá to listen to him. Lindenberg entered the building using his knowledge of the security systems from his work as a security guard. He made his way to the Pimentel family's apartment on the 14th floor and knocked on the door. When Eloá opened it, she was shocked to see him standing there with a pistol in his hand, his face twisted with anger and desperation. "We need to talk," Lindenberg said, pushing his way into the apartment before anyone could react. The 2 male classmates who were with Eloá and Niara immediately recognized the danger and managed to escape through the apartment's back entrance, but Eloá and Niara were trapped. What followed was the beginning of a 5-day ordeal that would captivate the nation and expose serious flaws in how Brazilian authorities handle crisis situations. Lindenberg barricaded himself in the apartment with the 2 girls, making it clear that he had no intention of leaving without getting what he wanted from Eloá. The escaped classmates immediately called the police, reporting that their friends were being held hostage by an armed man. Within hours, the apartment building was surrounded by police vehicles, and news crews began arriving to cover what was initially expected to be a brief standoff. But Lindenberg had no intention of surrendering quickly. He was determined to use the situation to force Eloá to listen to him, to make her understand how much he loved her, and to convince her to take him back. In his twisted logic, holding her hostage was an act of love rather than violence, a desperate attempt to save their relationship. The initial police response was chaotic and poorly coordinated. Officers from different units arrived at the scene without a clear command structure or unified strategy. There was confusion about who was in charge of the operation and what approach should be taken to resolve the situation safely. Media coverage of the hostage situation began almost immediately, with television crews setting up outside the building and reporters providing live updates on the developing story. What should have been a carefully controlled police operation quickly became a media circus, with helicopters circling overhead and cameras capturing every movement around the building. Inside the apartment, Lindenberg was aware of the media attention and seemed to be energized by it. He could see the news coverage on television and began to view himself as the star of his own dramatic production. This media attention would prove to be one of the most dangerous elements of the entire situation, feeding Lindenberg's ego and prolonging the crisis. The negotiation chaos. The police response to the hostage situation revealed a shocking lack of preparation and professionalism that would ultimately contribute to the tragic outcome. Rather than establishing a controlled perimeter and limiting communication with the hostage taker, authorities allowed the situation to become a media spectacle that fed Lindenberg's need for attention and validation. One of the most serious errors was the decision to allow journalists to communicate directly with Lindenberg by phone. Throughout the 5-day ordeal, reporters from various news outlets conducted live interviews with the hostage taker, giving him a platform to express his feelings, make demands, and present his version of events to the public. These interviews were broadcast live on national television, turning the crisis into entertainment and allowing Lindenberg to control the narrative. He spoke about his love for Eloá, his desperation at losing her, and his belief that he was fighting for their relationship. The media coverage portrayed him as a lovesick young man rather than a dangerous criminal holding innocent people hostage. Detective Sergeant Roberto Silva, who was assigned as the primary negotiator, found his efforts constantly undermined by the media circus surrounding the building. Every time he made progress in calming Lindenberg down, another journalist would call and rile him up again with questions about his relationship with Eloá or suggestions about how the situation might end. It was impossible to establish any kind of rapport or trust when he was constantly being distracted by phone calls from reporters. Detective Silva would later explain, "Every conversation we had was interrupted by someone else wanting to interview him for television. It was like trying to negotiate while competing with a talk show. The lack of communication control also meant that Lindenberg had access to real-time information about the police operation. He could watch news coverage of the situation and see exactly where officers were positioned, what equipment they were using, and what strategies they might be considering. This intelligence gave him significant advantages in planning his responses and maintaining control of the situation. Inside the apartment, Eloá and Niara were subjected to Lindenberg's increasingly erratic behavior as the media attention fed his delusions of importance. He would force them to listen as he gave interviews, using their presence as proof of his power and control. He alternated between treating them as beloved companions and dangerous enemies, depending on his mood and the feedback he was receiving from the outside world. The psychological pressure on the hostages was immense. They were trapped in a small space with an armed man who was becoming more unstable by the hour, while knowing that millions of people were watching their ordeal on television. They could hear helicopters overhead and see police lights flashing outside the windows, but they had no way of knowing when or how the situation would end. Professional hostage negotiators from other countries who observed the situation were appalled by the lack of control and coordination. The basic principles of hostage negotiation, isolation, controlled communication, and psychological pressure were being violated at every turn, creating a situation that was almost guaranteed to end badly. As the days passed, it became clear that the authorities had no coherent strategy for resolving the situation. They were reacting to events rather than controlling them, allowing Lindenberg to dictate the terms of the standoff, while the media turned the crisis into a national soap opera. The fatal decision. On the fourth day of the hostage crisis, October 16th, the police made a decision that would prove to be the most catastrophic error in an operation already marked by serious mistakes. After hours of negotiation, they had managed to secure the release of Nayara Rodriguez, who emerged from the apartment exhausted and traumatized but physically unharmed. The release of one hostage should have been treated as a significant victory and an opportunity to reassess the situation and develop a new strategy for securing Eloá's freedom. Instead, the authorities made an unprecedented and inexplicable decision that violated every principle of hostage negotiation. They allowed Nayara to return to the apartment. The justification given for this decision was that Nayara's presence would help calm Lindenberg and make him more likely to surrender peacefully. According to this logic, seeing that his former hostage was willing to return voluntarily would demonstrate trust and good faith, encouraging him to end the standoff without further violence. This reasoning was fundamentally flawed and contradicted decades of research and experience in hostage negotiation. Allowing a released hostage to return to captivity is considered one of the most dangerous mistakes that can be made in such situations, as it provides the hostage taker with renewed leverage and can escalate the situation dramatically. Professional negotiators who were following the case were stunned by the decision. Dr. Maria Santos, a psychologist who specializes in crisis intervention, would later describe it as the most irresponsible decision I have ever seen in a hostage situation. It violated every protocol and put both hostages in immediate danger. When Nayara returned to the apartment, Lindenberg's behavior changed dramatically. Rather than being calmed by her presence, he became more agitated and paranoid. He interpreted her return as evidence that the police were trying to trick him, and he began to suspect that she might be working with authorities to undermine him. The return of the second hostage also gave Lindenberg renewed leverage in his negotiations with police. He now had two people under his control again, doubling his bargaining power and making any potential rescue operation much more complicated and dangerous. Inside the apartment, the atmosphere became increasingly tense as Lindenberg's mental state deteriorated. He was exhausted from days of stress and media attention, and his grip on reality was becoming more tenuous. He began to see threats and conspiracies everywhere, and his treatment of the hostages became more erratic and violent. The final hours, the morning of October 17, 2008, marked the fifth day of the hostage crisis, and tensions had reached a breaking point. Lindenberg had become increasingly unstable overnight, alternating between periods of rage and despair as the reality of his situation began to sink in. The media attention that had initially fed his ego was now adding to his stress, as he realized that his actions had made him a national villain rather than a romantic hero. At approximately 3 p.m., Lindenberg's behavior took a dramatic turn for the worse. He became convinced that the police were planning to storm the apartment and that Eloá and Niara were somehow working against him. His paranoia and desperation reached a fever pitch, and he began making increasingly violent threats against both hostages. At 4:30 p.m., the sound of gunshots echoed from the apartment, sending shockwaves through the crowd of police officers, journalists, and onlookers who had been following the crisis. The shots were followed by screaming, and then an ominous silence that suggested the worst had happened. The police tactical team immediately prepared to storm the apartment, but the operation was hampered by confusion and poor coordination. Officers were unsure about the layout of the apartment, the exact location of the hostages, and Lindenberg's position. The lack of proper planning and preparation became evident as the rescue attempt began. When officers finally breached the apartment door, they found a scene of devastation that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Eloá was lying on the floor, critically wounded by a gunshot to the head. Naira had been shot in the face but was conscious and crying for help. Lindenberg was also wounded but alive, having apparently shot himself after attacking the hostages. Eloá was rushed to Hospital das Clínicas in São Paulo, where a team of neurosurgeons worked desperately to save her life. The bullet had caused massive brain damage, and her condition was critical from the moment she arrived at the hospital. Despite the medical team's best efforts, she never regained consciousness. The news of the shooting spread rapidly across Brazil, with television stations providing live coverage of the ambulances racing through São Paulo traffic and the medical team's efforts to save Eloá's life. The nation that had watched the crisis unfold for 5 days now waited anxiously to learn whether the young girl would survive, but the damage was too severe. After hours of surgery and intensive care, doctors declared that Eloá's brain injuries were incompatible with life. She died on October 18, 2008, just 1 day after being shot, bringing a tragic end to a crisis that had captivated and horrified the entire country. The investigation and trial. The death of Eloá Pimentel triggered an immediate and comprehensive investigation into the police handling of the hostage crisis. The São Paulo state government appointed a special commission to examine every aspect of the operation, from the initial response to the final tragic outcome. What they discovered was a catalogue of errors and failures that had contributed to the death of an innocent teenager. The investigation revealed that the police response had been characterized by poor planning, inadequate training, and a fundamental misunderstanding of hostage negotiation principles. The decision to allow media access to Lindenberg had violated basic protocols, and had given him psychological advantages that professional negotiators worked to deny. Colonel José Martínez, who led the investigation, described the operation as a textbook example of how not to handle a hostage situation. His report identified numerous critical errors, including the failure to establish a secure perimeter, the lack of communication, control, and the absence of a unified command structure. The decision to allow Naira to return to the apartment was singled out as the most serious error in the operation. The investigation found that this decision had been made without proper consultation with experts, and had directly contributed to the escalation that led to the shooting. The trial of Lindenberg Alves began in 2012, 4 years after the hostage crisis. The prosecution argued that the killing had been premeditated and involved torture, making it eligible for the harshest possible sentence under Brazilian law. They presented evidence of Lindenberg's controlling behavior during his relationship with Eloá, and showed that he had planned the hostage-taking in advance. The defense attempted to argue that Lindenberg's actions were the result of mental illness, but this was undermined by evidence of his calculated behavior during the crisis. His ability to conduct coherent interviews with journalists and his strategic use of the hostages as leverage suggested that he was in control of his actions. The most emotional testimony came from Eloá's mother, Ana Cristina Pimentel, who described the impact that her daughter's death had had on her family. "My daughter wanted to be a lawyer, to help people and fight for justice," she testified through tears. Instead, she became a victim of injustice herself, killed by someone who claimed to love her but who really saw her as his property. On March 15, 2012, Lindenberg was sentenced to 98 years and 10 months in prison, one of the longest sentences ever handed down in a Brazilian court for crimes of this nature. The sentence reflected the multiple charges he had been convicted of, including qualified homicide for Eloá's death, attempted homicide for the attack on Naira, and kidnapping for holding both girls hostage. The legacy. The death of Eloá Pimentel left a lasting impact on Brazilian society that extended far beyond the immediate tragedy of her murder. Her case became a watershed moment in the country's understanding of domestic violence and femicide, sparking national conversations about the protection of women and the need for institutional reforms. The São Paulo State Police implemented comprehensive reforms in response to the failures exposed by Eloá's case. New protocols were established for hostage negotiations, including strict controls on media access and communication with hostages. Specialized units were created with better training and equipment, and regular exercises were conducted to ensure readiness for future crises. Media organizations also faced scrutiny for their role in the tragedy. The decision to allow live interviews with Lindenberg during the crisis was widely condemned by journalism ethics experts, leading to new guidelines for covering hostage situations and other sensitive police operations. The case contributed to the passage of stronger domestic violence legislation in Brazil, including laws that specifically addressed stalking and harassment by former partners. Eloá's story was frequently cited by lawmakers as evidence of the need for better protection for women who are threatened by ex-boyfriends or ex-husbands. Educational programs about domestic violence began using Eloá's case as an example of how controlling behavior can escalate to deadly violence. Her story helped young women recognize the warning signs of abusive relationships and encouraged them to seek help before situations became dangerous. Nayara Rodriguez, who survived the attack but was left with permanent facial scarring, became an advocate for victims of domestic violence. Eloá's death taught us that love should never hurt, Nayara said in one of her speeches. When someone says they love you but tries to control you, that's not love, that's possession. And possession can be deadly. Reflective conclusion. The tragedy of Eloá Pimentel represents one of the most preventable deaths in Brazilian criminal history. A case where multiple institutional failures combined to create a perfect storm that cost an innocent young woman her life. Her death forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about domestic violence, media responsibility, and the competence of those entrusted with protecting public safety. Eloá's story is particularly heartbreaking because she had done everything right. She had recognized that her relationship with Lindenberg was unhealthy and had found the courage to end it. She was focused on her education and her future, determined to build a life based on her own dreams and ambitions rather than someone else's expectations. But her strength and independence, qualities that should have been celebrated and protected, instead made her a target for a man who couldn't accept rejection. Lindenberg's inability to respect her autonomy and his decision to use violence to maintain control over her represent the worst aspects of toxic masculinity and possessive love. The police failures during the hostage crisis were so fundamental and so numerous that they raised serious questions about training, leadership, and institutional competence. The decision to allow media access to Lindenberg, the failure to maintain communication control, and the inexplicable choice to return Nayara to captivity all violated basic principles of crisis management. Perhaps most tragically, these failures were entirely preventable. The protocols and procedures needed to handle the situation properly already existed, they were simply not followed. The authorities had the tools and knowledge necessary to save Eloá's life, but they failed to use them effectively. The media's role in the tragedy cannot be overlooked. The decision to treat a hostage crisis as entertainment, to give a dangerous criminal a platform to express his views, and to prioritize ratings over public safety contributed directly to the tragic outcome. Eloá's death serves as a reminder that domestic violence is not a private matter between couples, but a serious crime that requires professional intervention and societal response. Her case shows how quickly controlling behavior can escalate to deadly violence, and how important it is for institutions to take threats against women seriously. The changes that have been implemented in response to Eloá's death, better police training, stronger domestic violence laws, improved media guidelines, represent important progress in protecting women and preventing similar tragedies. But these improvements came too late to save her, and they serve as a costly reminder of the price of institutional failure. Eloá Pimentel died twice. First at the hands of a man who claimed to love her but saw her as his property, and second through the negligence of institutions that should have protected her, but instead turned her suffering into a spectacle. Her legacy is not just the tragedy of her death but the changes that have been made to ensure that other young women don't suffer the same fate. In the end, Eloá's story is a call to action for all of us to recognize the warning signs of domestic violence, to support women who are trying to escape controlling relationships, and to demand competence and professionalism from the institutions we trust with our safety. Her memory deserves nothing less than our complete commitment to creating a world where love never becomes prison, and where saying no is always respected. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel to learn about other cases that highlight the importance of protecting women from domestic violence and the ongoing fight to ensure that institutions serve and protect rather than fail those who need them most.